Your character arcs, the way that you're developing your characters, may not be working. And the reason? Your arcs might be the wrong shape. Wait, aren't the arcs arc-shaped? We think a lot about the magnitude of character change, where the character starts out and where they end up. But we don't think as much about the path that they take to get there. How the change in a character happens through the course of the novel is going to affect the story and the character in profound ways. Visualizing how this change progresses might help you understand and fix any issues with it. Speaking of issues, never miss an issue of this channel by subscribing. Wait, is this a magazine or a video channel? I mean, it can't be a video, there's all this paper around. All right, so in his lectures, Brandon Sanderson talks about these character sliders. So basically, the character will be at a point on one of these sliders, or at different points on these different sliders, and you'll move them either up or down depending on the arc that they go through. And the arc of a character is going to involve them moving across one or more of these different sliders. So the three he talks about are competency, which is basically the skill of the character. So this, moving from this end to this end, is basically like your master apprentice plot. The character starts out really unskilled, and then through the course of the story, they become more and more skilled, more and more competent in order to deal with the main conflict of the story. Proactivity is basically the agency of the character. You see this a lot in character versus self conflicts, where the character has some kind of internal self-doubt or depression or something that's causing them to not take action that they need to take. And over the course of the story, they become more proactive and start dealing with the problems in the rest of the plot. Likability, the last one, is sort of the hero-villain axis. It's how much the reader likes the character, so that usually maps onto who's a hero and who's a villain, although you can have likable villains and unlikable heroes, so that's not necessarily always true. But likability is basically the reader's opinion of the character. Now, these sliders work really well for understanding the basic dynamics of a character arc, where you're starting the character out and where they're ending up over the course of the story. Sort of understanding the magnitude of the change. But the path that the character takes to go from one end of a slider to the other is really important, and that's what I want to talk about in this video. You can have two characters who have the same magnitude of change, but because they take different paths to that change, they're going to create two very different stories. So to look at this through time, we're going to take one of these sliders and basically plot it out for the length of the story. So up here I have the slider that I'm looking at. So let's say this is the skill one, the competency. So this is low skill, this is high skill, and then this is kind of the progress of the plot. So the start of the story to the end of the story. So let's look at two different characters that take kind of a different path to arrive at the same point. Say character A starts out here at the beginning of the story with no skill, and they have a very straight, kind of linear progress all the way up to where they need to be to deal with the conflict at the end of the story. So let's look at another character. They start out at the same point and need to end at the same point because they need to deal with the same conflict, but they take a different path. So maybe they start out and don't make very much progress, and then they have a little bit of progress, and then they kind of stall out for a little while, and then they have a big jump in progress, and then they kind of stall out a little bit more, and then they kind of slowly get better, and then towards the end they have a big spike in understanding, and they finally get to where they need to be. These two characters are going through the same arc. They're starting out as kind of the same person, and they're ending up as the same person, the same different person, you know what I mean, at the end of the story. But how they got there is very different. The stories of the red character versus the green character are going to read way different. This linear change, this red arc here, is probably a more boring story because there's going to be less tension. There's less uncertainty about whether the character is going to get the skills that they need in order to resolve the conflict. Slowing down the change, as we've done here with this green arc, and adding in these sort of lulls, these periods where the character is not making progress, that's going to actually increase tension. In fact, there's probably an inverse relationship between the tension of the story and the progress that the character is making on the arc that they need to go through. If learning a skill is a major need of the character, a major goal of the character, then spending time where they're not learning that skill is going to increase tension because they're not making progress to where they need to be. Now, while not making progress can help to increase tension and arguably improve the story in a lot of ways, it can also be problematic. So let's look at a different graph. So this time we're going to look at the proactivity of the character. Proactivity, I don't have room to write that. So this is basically how willing or how much action the character is taking in order to resolve the conflict of the story. So let's again look at a couple of different examples. So let's say that the character starts out right here, so very low proactivity, and to resolve the conflict, they need to start taking action. They need to become way more proactive. If we have a character who goes like this, who they don't become proactive, they keep not doing what they need to do, until the very end of the story, and then they shoot up in proactivity and finally take care of the problems, this is probably going to be a very boring story for a few reasons. This character is likely going to become very one note because there's no change, there's no movement towards becoming more proactive. This is especially bad for characters that lack proactivity because characters who aren't taking action tend to be oftentimes a little bit more boring to read about. The readers tend to like them a little bit less because there's literally nothing happening here. The character is not taking action. But sometimes you want this. Sometimes this is the kind of character that you want to write about. And them not taking action, them not improving and moving towards fixing their problems could be a major theme in the story. We see this in a lot of different plots in a lot of different novels. So in that case, what's often better to do is rather than having the character start out at their lowest point and stay there until the very end where they figure out what they need to do, it might be better to actually start them a little bit higher and move them lower through the course of the story. Have them get less proactive, have them doubt themselves more, have them maybe be a little bit more depressed throughout the story. So don't just keep them level, bring them down to a lower point, and then right at the end you can have them ramp up and come to terms with whatever they need to come to terms with and resolve the conflict in the story. These two arcs accomplish the same thing, but the green one creates a sense of movement. It's downward movement, but it's still movement. Movement is generally more interesting to read about than this kind of arc where the character's going to become kind of one note and there's not going to be a lot going on. This sense of movement is a good way to show progress and make the middle of the story especially much more interesting. Now the last example I want to talk about involves this third slider, the likability slider, and this is to do with redemption arcs. So in this case, what we're looking at is the likability of the character through time. At this end, they're a villain, and at the top end, they're a hero. At this end, the reader doesn't like them. At the top end, the reader does like them, and they're going to move from starting out here up to here to being likable by the end of the story. Now, quick redemption arcs can be a little bit difficult because if you have a character who's unlikable throughout the story and then they suddenly become likable at the end, that's really hard to pull off. It's really hard to change reader opinion about a character this quickly right at the end of the story. In this case, this is often when you have the villain doing like a last-minute heroic sacrifice where they try to redeem themselves, but the only way to redeem themselves is to sacrifice themselves, that kind of thing. This is not the kind of arc where you end up with a villain that has now become a likable hero. Instead, what you can do on a redemption arc is you can start with a slightly more likable villain, and I think redemption arcs are a bigger topic that we can maybe talk about on another day, but in order to properly do a redemption arc, you generally need to have a little bit of likability, or at least, if not that, a little bit of sympathy for the villain earlier on in the story. And then you can kind of slowly change that through the course of the story. The best redemption arcs are a bit of a slow burn, where the villain slowly moves over to the likability side of things, rather than a sudden turn right at the end or a sudden turn right at the start. Is you can start on the path, you can do things that will make them more likable, and then you can have them turn around and go evil again. So you can give the character an opportunity to do the right thing and become likable, and then you can switch them around and have them betray the heroes or something, or not turn against their evil villain master or what have you, and make them temporarily more unlikable before you start to move them back up and they start working on the path to becoming likable. So just like with the proactivity and just like with the skill, not having a straight shot, a straight linear shot all the way from villain to hero, from unlikable to likable, that's not necessarily the most interesting story. You can create a lot of tension, and you can make the arc probably land a little bit better with the reader if there are some ups and downs, if there's a little bit of unpredictability, if it's not just a straight movement from, in this case, unlikable to likable. So what are the takeaways from all of this rambling and graph drawing? Well, you probably don't need to actually draw out the arcs of your characters, but if you want to, you probably can. It might be helpful. What you want to do is think about the progress of the arc through the novel. Think about the places where the character makes progress, where they start to come closer to attaining whatever change they need to attain. Also think about the times that they have setbacks, the things that move them further away from their goals, the ups and downs. Pay close attention to any times where there's not a lot of movement in the arc. This can create tension for things like skill, as we saw in the first set of graphs, but if you let it go too long, it's just going to drag, the character is going to seem a bit one note, it's going to feel like the story has stalled out. I think overall, remember that the path of change for the character doesn't need to be a straight line. There can be some ups and downs, setbacks. All of those things can enhance your story. Just like this video, hopefully will enhance your story, I hope. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.